The desert didn't care for the troubles of men or women. It was a vast, sun-bleached canvas of indifference, and Elara Vance was a mere speck of fading color upon it. At 30, she was considered a spinster in the crowded, judgmental East, a woman whose prospects had dried up like a creek in a drought. The letter from her late father's associate, detailing a small inheritance in the form of a struggling general store in the town of Solitude, Arizona Territory, was her last chance. Solitude lived up to its name. A clutch of sun-baked adobe and timber buildings huddled around a dusty main street. It was a place where dreams came to be buried. Her inheritance, Vance's mercantile, was on the verge of collapse, its shelves thinly stocked, its accounts deep in the red. The townsfolk, a hard-bitten lot of miners, cattlemen, and their families, viewed her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She was an outsider, an eastern flower they expected to wither and blow away. It was on a desperate trip to secure supplies from a freight line that she first saw him. His name was Kaya, a man of the White Mountain Apache, who traded finely tanned deer hides and powerful herbs for bullets and flour. He was a silhouette of quiet strength, his face a landscape of high cheekbones and a firm, unsmiling mouth. His eyes, dark and perceptive, seemed to see past the dust and desperation on her into the very core of her being. He was a man of few words, but his presence commanded the space around him. Their interactions began as simple trade. He would bring his goods. She would offer fair value. A fragile respect grew in the silent spaces between their transactions. Elara, lonely and terrified of failing, found herself drawn to his solidity, his connection to the harsh land that baffled her. For Kaya, she was a puzzle, a woman of obvious education who did not flinch from hard work, whose green eyes held a deep, unspoken sorrow that resonated with his own understanding of loss. He began to appear more frequently, sometimes helping her with heavy crates or repairing a broken shutter, tasks he performed with an innate, efficient grace. One evening, as a spectacular desert sunset bled across the sky, he did not leave. He stood by the counter and spoke of his people, of their ways, and of his own solitude. He was a bridge between two worlds, respected by his own but often isolated from the whites. A man needs a partner, he said, his voice a low rumble. A woman to share the burdens and the quiet moments. A woman to build a future with, to raise a family with. The words raise a family struck Elara like a physical blow. It was the one thing she could never do. A fever in her youth had stolen that possibility, a secret she carried like a lead weight in her soul. It was the reason suitors in the East had faded away. To speak it now would be to shatter this fragile, beautiful thing growing between them. In the raw honesty of the desert, she made a desperate, dishonest choice. She saw a life with him, a life of purpose, away from the failing store and the pitying stares of solitude. A life where perhaps her other qualities could be enough. She met his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. I would like that, Kaya, a future. The wedding was not in a church. It was a simple ceremony that blended their two worlds, held on a mesa overlooking the town. Elara wore a simple dress of cream-colored calico. Kaya, his best buckskin trousers and a beaded vest. A few of his clansmen attended, their faces impassive. The townsfolk watched from a distance, their murmurs a mixture of disapproval and morbid curiosity. As they exchanged vows under the vast, star-strewn sky. Elara poured all her hope into the belief that her love and dedication would be a fair trade for the children she could never give him. She saw the quiet joy in Kaya's eyes, a look of a man who had found his anchor, his path forward. He was building a new world in his mind, a world that included a sturdy cabin, the laughter of children, and this strong, enigmatic woman by his side. He took her hand, his grip warm and sure. You are my wife, Elara, my heart and my future. Together, we will be strong. Our family will be our legacy." Elara smiled, a beautiful brittle thing, and pushed the truth so deep inside herself she almost believed it was gone. She had her bargain. She had her man. And she prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening that the price for her deception would never come due. The first year of their marriage was a tapestry woven with threads of profound happiness and subtle growing dread. They built a cabin in a high canyon a half-day's ride from Solitude, a place where the air was clean and the only sounds were the wind through the pinyons and the cry of hawks. Kaya was a good husband, attentive, hard-working, and deeply in love with the Eastern woman who had so readily embraced his world. Elara learned to tan hides, to identify edible plants and potent medicines, to read the stories written in the tracks of animals. She found a strength in herself she never knew existed, a resilience that matched the desert landscape. Their love was a real and powerful force, a fire that warmed the cool canyon nights. Yet, every time Kaya looked at her with a certain softness in his eyes, every time his hand rested on her belly with unspoken hope, a sliver of ice pierced her heart. She began a ritual of deception, tracking the moon cycles on a hidden scrap of paper, feigning the signs of fertility she knew would never come. She'd mention a slight discomfort or a delay, feeding him crumbs of hope that only made the eventual monthly disappointment more crushing. With each cycle, Kaya's quiet optimism would dim, replaced by a contemplative silence that felt heavier than any spoken accusation. The cracks first appeared in town. Solitude had never fully accepted their union, and now, as months turned into a year with no visible pregnancy, the whispers began to coagulate into loud, cruel speculation. "Barren." "That one," hissed Martha Cullens, the blacksmith's wife, within Elara's earshot outside the post office. "A fine, strong man like that Apache wasted on a dried-up eastern prune. It's a shame." Elara pretended not to hear, her cheeks burning. But the words festered. The man who gave the whispers a voice was Silas Rook, the town's undertaker, and a man whose soul seemed to be fashioned from the same gloom as his profession. Rook was a recent arrival himself, a gaunt, pale man with eyes the color of a winter sky and a tongue that dripped with righteous venom. He saw the mixed marriage as an abomination and Elara's childlessness as divine judgment. One afternoon, Elara rode into Solitude alone to collect a shipment of fabric. As she dismounted, Rook stepped out from the shadowed porch of his funeral parlor, blocking her path. "Mrs. Kaya," he said, his voice slick as oil. "A word." Elara stiffened. "Mr. Rook, I couldn't help but notice the lack of little ones running about your place." He smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "A tragedy. A man like your husband must crave a son, a legacy. It is the way of his people, is it not? And of all people, perhaps the Lord has closed your womb. A punishment, some might say, for stepping outside the natural order." Elara's breath caught in her throat. The directness of the attack, the venom in his words, left her speechless with a mixture of rage and terror. She pushed past him without a word, his low, mocking chuckle following her into the mercantile. That night in their canyon home, she was distant. Kaya, perceptive as always, noticed. "The town buzzes like flies on meat," he said, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "What did they say to you?" "It was nothing," Elara whispered, stirring the stew pot over the fire. "Just Silas Rook, spouting his nonsense." Kaya was silent for a long time. "Rook is a snake, but the words of a snake can still carry poison. They say you are barren." The word, spoken aloud in his deep, steady voice, hung in the air between them, final and devastating. Elara felt the world tilt. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. This was the moment. This was when she should have fallen to her knees and confessed everything. begged for his understanding. Instead, a different, more terrible instinct took hold. The instinct of a cornered animal. She turned to him, her face a mask of wounded pride and feigned outrage. "And you believe them?" she cried, her voice trembling with expertly manufactured emotion. "You listen to the gossip of that vulture over your own wife? He hates us, Kaya. He wants to drive us apart. He probably spreads rumors that you are the one unable to father a child to wound your pride." She saw the effect of her words immediately. A flicker of doubt in his eyes, not about her, but about his own judgment. To question a man's virility was a deep insult in his culture, a potent weapon. His jaw tightened. The concern in his eyes was replaced by a cold, hard anger, but it was not directed at her. "You are right," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My ears were foolish. The words of that man are wind. Pay him no mind." He came to her and held her, and Elara buried her face in his shoulder, weeping with genuine shame and terror. She had won this battle. She had redirected his anger, but she had also poured fuel on a smoldering fire. She had made an enemy of Silas Rook in Kaya's mind, and in doing so, she had bound her fate to a lie that was growing more unstable with every passing day. The foundation of their happiness was cracking, and she was the one who was lying in the cracks, trying to hold it all together. The lie began to rot from the inside out. Elara's deception, once a secret burden, became an active performance. She consulted a tattered medical book she'd brought from the East, learning the symptoms of early pregnancy. She began to feign nausea in the mornings, pushing her breakfast around her plate. She claimed a strange fatigue, retiring early from their evenings by the fire. She even subtly loosened the waistbands of her dresses. Kaya watched it all with a heart full of rekindled hope and a warrior's growing suspicion. The hope was a desperate, fragile thing. The suspicion was a cold, hard stone in his gut. He saw the way her symptoms appeared and vanished with a strange convenience. He noticed her lack of the true, deep radiance he had seen in the women of his tribe during pregnancy. Her performance was convincing on the surface, but it lacked the unshakable, spiritual truth of the real thing. He began to ride into Solitude more frequently, not to trade, but to listen. He would sit in the shadowed corner of the saloon, a silent statue, and the conversations around him would ebb and flow. He heard the whispers, not just from Silas Rook, but from others now, emboldened by the undertaker's crusade. "Playing him for a fool," a miner slurred one evening. "My woman says it's all an act. She's as barren as the salt flats." Kaya's hand tightened around his glass. The words were poison, but they resonated with a doubt taking root in his own heart. He loved Elara with a ferocity that scared him, but he was a man of the earth, of cycles and seasons. He knew truth, and he was starting to feel its absence in his own home. The breaking point came on a night of a fierce thunderstorm. Lightning forked across the black sky, illuminating the canyon in brief, terrifying flashes. Elara was in their bed, pretending to be asleep. Kaya was checking the security of the corral when a brilliant flash of lightning struck a nearby ponderosa pine, splitting it with a sound like the end of the world. In the immediate, deafening silence that followed, he heard a cry from the cabin. Not a cry of fear from the storm, but a raw, agonized sob. He rushed inside to find Elara kneeling on the floor, her body convulsing with tears. In her hand, she clutched the hidden calendar, the damning record of her lies, now illuminated by the flickering firelight. She looked up at him, her face a mask of utter despair. The storm had shattered her last vestige of control. "I lost it, Kaya," she wailed, the lie falling from her lips even in her breakdown. "The baby. The shock of the lightning. I lost our baby." Kaya stood frozen in the doorway, rainwater dripping from his hair and onto the packed earth floor. He did not move to comfort her. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes seeing through the performance, past the tears, and into the deep, foundational lie. He looked at the paper in her hand, at the carefully marked X's, and he understood everything. The hope that had lived in his heart for over a year died in that instant. It did not fade. It was extinguished, completely and utterly. He walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. He knelt not to hold her, but to gently pry the crumpled calendar from her grasp. He smoothed it out, his eyes scanning the evidence of her long calculated deception. "There was no baby," he said, his voice not loud, but hollow, empty of all emotion. It was a statement of fact, not a question. Elara stared at him, her sobs catching in her throat. The truth was in his eyes, a terrible, flat finality. There was no point in lying anymore. The performance was over. She crumpled forward, her forehead touching the cool earth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I was so afraid of losing you. I thought I could be enough. I thought my love could be enough." Kaya stood up. He looked down at the woman he had loved, the woman he had built a future around, the woman who had built that future on a bed of sand. "My love for you was a river," he said, his voice still terrifyingly calm. "It was strong and it was true. But you have poisoned the spring from which it flowed. You have made me a fool in the eyes of my people and yours. You have stolen the future from me, Elara. You have stolen my name." He turned and walked out of the cabin into the raging storm. He did not take a horse. He simply disappeared into the darkness and the lashing rain. A man vanishing into the elements, his world, his heart, and his legacy utterly destroyed. Elara was left alone on the floor, with nothing but the sound of the storm and the crushing weight of the truth. She had feared losing him, and in her fear, she had guaranteed it. Kaya did not return with the dawn. For 3 days, Elara waited in the crushing silence of the cabin, jumping at every sound, her hope dwindling with each passing hour. The storm had washed the world clean, but it could not cleanse the stain of her betrayal. On the 4th day, she saddled her horse and rode to the places he loved, the high mesa, the hidden spring, the grove of ancient junipers. He was gone. Fear, a cold and sharp-toothed thing, began to gnaw at her. She rode into Solitude, her face pale, her eyes shadowed. The townsfolk watched her with a new, knowing intensity. The story, it seemed, had outpaced her. Silas Rook stood on his porch, his arms crossed, a grim smile of satisfaction on his lips. He didn't need to speak. His expression said it all. Judgment has come. She found no comfort, no information. Kaya had vanished from the world he knew. He had not vanished from the earth. He had ascended into the high, lonely places, the sacred peaks where the air was thin and the spirits of his ancestors whispered on the wind. For 3 days and 3 nights he fasted and prayed, not for guidance, but for strength. The love he had felt for Elara had been a warm, living thing. Now, a cold, hard stone sat in its place. The man who had built a cabin and dreamed of children was gone. In his place was something older, fiercer, a reflection of the merciless desert. He had not just been betrayed by a woman. He had been dishonored by an entire community. Their whispers had been the chorus to her lie. They had judged her, and by extension, they had judged him. They had reveled in his humiliation. Silas Rook had been the spear point, but the town had been the shaft. In the intricate, honor-bound logic of his grief and rage, they were all complicit. They had poisoned the well of his life in Solitude. He returned to the outskirts of town not as Kaya the traitor, the husband, but as a force of retribution. He watched from the ridges as Silas Rook held a gathering outside the saloon, pontificating to a rapt audience about the sinfulness of the mixed marriage and the clear judgment of God. in the woman's barrenness and the man's disappearance. Kaya's face was a mask of stone. The words were just more venom, but they confirmed his path. He began his work not with fire or bullet, but with silence and absence. He started with the symbols of the town's life. One morning, the ranchers on the outskirts found their water wells filled with rock and sand. Not a trace of the perpetrator. The next night, the freight company's corral gate was mysteriously opened, and their valuable draft horses were scattered to the winds. A few days later, the town's lone milk cow was found dead, not from violence, but from a rare, poisonous weed that never grew in that area. Placed deliberately in its feed, the attacks were clever, untraceable, and deeply unsettling. They were not the work of a random vandal. They were the calculated moves of a predator isolating its prey. A cold dread began to seep into Solitude. Doors were bolted at night. Men carried rifles even to the outhouse. Silas Rook, however, saw opportunity in the fear. He stood on a crate in the main street, his voice ringing out. This is his work. The savage. He punishes us for speaking God's truth. This is not mere mischief. It is a declaration of war. We must hunt him down. A party was formed, a dozen nervous men led by Rook and the blustering sheriff. They rode out into the canyons, full of whiskey-fueled bravado. They found nothing but mocking signs of his presence, a recently extinguished campfire, a single, perfectly placed eagle feather, the distant echoing call of a coyote that sounded unnervingly like a human laugh. They returned empty-handed. Their courage evaporated, their fear multiplied. Kaya was not a man to be cornered like an animal. He was the land itself, and he was watching them. He was making them feel the same powerlessness, the same creeping dread that Elara's lie had made him feel. The cold stone in his heart was spreading its chill through the entire town of Solitude. The mood in Solitude curdled from fear into a thick, paranoid rage. Kaya's campaign of psychological warfare was working perfectly. The town felt besieged by a ghost. The loss of the milk cow meant no fresh milk for children or coffee. The scattered draft horses delayed a crucial silver shipment, costing the mining company money. The poisoned well on the Henderson ranch forced them to drive their cattle miles away, straining men and resources. Silas Rook was the town's self-appointed firebrand. He stood on the porch of his funeral parlor, a business he noted with grim pleasure was likely to see an uptick, and preached a sermon of righteous extermination. He is not a man. Rook thundered, his pale face flushed with passion. He is a demon of the wilderness sent to test us. He has declared war on civilization itself, on our homes, our livelihoods. Will we cower in our houses? Or will we rise up and cleanse this land? His words found fertile ground in the terrified, frustrated men. A larger, better-armed posse was formed, this time with a clear goal: find Kaya's canyon home and destroy it. It was a declaration. If he would attack the symbols of their civilization, they would destroy his. Elara heard the commotion from inside the boarded-up mercantile, where she had been hiding for days. When she understood their intent, a fresh terror seized her. They weren't just hunting her husband. They were going to destroy the last physical remnant of their life together, the place where she had been happiest and had committed her greatest sin. She ran into the street, her hair wild, her dress dusty. "Stop, please, you don't understand." The men turned, their faces hard. Rook looked down at her with contempt. "Understand? We understand perfectly, woman. You brought this upon us. You lay down with a snake and are surprised when it bites. Stand aside." "It's my fault," she cried, desperation stripping away her last shred of pride. "I lied to him. I am Barren. He is hurt. He is grieving. This is my doing, not his." Her public confession sent a ripple through the crowd. Some looked away, shamed. Others, fueled by Rook's rhetoric, saw it as irrelevant. The why does not matter, Rook sneered. Only the what, and what he is doing is making war on us. Now move, or I will have you moved. The posse rode out, a cloud of dust and grim determination. Elara stood alone in the suddenly quiet street, the eyes of the remaining women and children upon her. She was an outcast twice over. The posse found the cabin easily. It stood silent and empty in the canyon, a monument to a broken dream. They did not find Kaya. Emboldened by his absence and enraged by the futility of their hunt, they gave in to their base instincts. They did not simply burn it. They desecrated it. Furniture Kaya had carved by hand was smashed. Elara's few precious books from the east were torn and tossed onto the growing pyre. Then they set it all ablaze, whooping as the flames licked the sky, a primitive ritual of destruction. From a high ledge, hidden among the rocks, Kaya watched. He had expected this. The burning cabin was not a loss. It was the final severance. The last tie to his old life was now smoke and ash. The cold stone in his heart did not warm with anger. It grew colder, harder, more absolute. They had not just attacked him. They had violated his home, a sacred concept to his people. The line had been crossed. The men, feeling victorious, began their ride back to Solitude. Their triumph was short-lived. Kaya was no longer just isolating them. Now he would become the whirlwind. He shadowed them, a phantom in the dusk. He used the land itself as his weapon. As the posse rode single file along a narrow trail flanked by unstable scree, he dislodged a carefully chosen boulder. It started a small avalanche, not enough to bury them, but enough to spook their horses and send one man, Sam Henderson, tumbling down the slope with a broken leg dot as they scrambled to help their comrade. A single rifle shot rang out, echoing through the canyons. It didn't hit a man. It hit the whiskey bottle tucked in Silas Rook's saddlebag, showering him in glass and liquor. A message of terrifying accuracy. Panic set in. They were being hunted. They built a defensive perimeter and spent a terrified night in the open, jumping at every shadow, while Kaya's voice, speaking in his native tongue, echoed around them, a mournful, chilling chant that spoke of loss and coming vengeance. He was no longer just a man they had wronged. He was the spirit of the land they had disrespected, and he had them in his grip. The whirlwind had them, and the shadow was closing in. The broken, demoralized posse stumbled back into Solitude at first light, carrying Sam Henderson on a makeshift stretcher. Their faces were gaunt with fear and exhaustion. The story they told of the phantom rifle shot, the echoing chants, the broken legs sent a new, deeper terror through the town. This was no longer about property. It was about survival. Kaya had them exactly where he wanted them. The siege of Solitude began not with an army, but with an idea, the idea that the town itself was a trap. The next night, the livery stable caught fire. It was set with a cunning that spoke of intimate knowledge, a pile of dry hay placed against the back wall, ignited by a slow-burning fuse made of twisted grass. By the time the bell was rung, the structure was an inferno. The townsfolk formed a bucket brigade, but as they worked desperately to save the adjacent buildings, a series of gunshots rang out from the darkness. They weren't aimed to kill, but to terrify. Bullets whizzed over their heads, smashing windows in the saloon and the hotel. The message was clear: help your neighbor, and you become a target. The bucket brigade dissolved into a panicked scramble for cover. The livery burned to the ground, taking with it several horses and wagons. The following day, a deathly quiet fell over the town. No one ventured out for work. The mines sat idle. The stores remained closed, their owners peering through shuttered windows. Solitude was now a ghost town of the living, paralyzed by fear. Silas Rook, however, was not a man to be cowed. He saw the chaos as his moment to seize control. He armed himself with a shotgun and patrolled the streets, a self-appointed marshal of the apocalypse. This is what happens when we show weakness. He roared to anyone who would listen. We must burn him out. We must go into the canyons and not return until his head is on a pike. But his rhetoric had lost its power. The men were tired, scared, and broken. They had seen the futility of hunting a ghost. Elara, watching from a crack in her boarding house room, felt a horrifying duality. The town was suffering for her sin, and a part of her felt they deserved it for their cruelty. But the man she loved, or the man he had become, was now a monster of vengeance, and she was the one who had created him. She had to stop it. She had to face him. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, she slipped out of her room. She took a single horse from the small corral behind the blacksmith's, which had miraculously been spared. She rode out of the silent, terrified town, not knowing if she was riding to her death, but knowing she was riding toward the only thing that could possibly end this, the truth, spoken directly to him. She went to the one place she thought he might be, the sacred spring deep in the canyon, a place he had once shown her in a moment of shared intimacy. It was a place of pure, clean water, a stark contrast to the poison she had introduced into their lives. She dismounted and walked the final distance on foot, her heart pounding in her throat. The clearing was silent, bathed in starlight. For a long time she stood there alone. "I am here, Kaya," she said, her voice trembling but clear in the stillness. "I am alone." There was no answer, only the sigh of the wind. "I came to tell you that they burned our home," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "They destroyed everything. They are everything you believe them to be. Cruel and small and hateful." She sank to her knees. "But this vengeance ... It is not you. The man I married was strong, but he was not cruel. He was just. This is my doing. I see that now. I poisoned you with my lie, and now that poison is spreading through this entire valley. I am so sorry. I was a coward. I was so afraid of being alone that I made the worst kind of loneliness for us both." She waited, her body shaking with sobs. Then, from the deep shadows at the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. It was Kaya. He looked older, his face etched with a grief that was as vast as the desert. In his eyes she saw the cold stone, but also a flicker of the man she knew. "You speak the truth now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "But it is a truth that comes too late. The path is chosen. The whirlwind must finish its turn. Then let it finish with me," Elara pleaded, looking up at him. "Take my life. It is yours to take. It is the only payment I can offer. But let the town be. They acted out of fear and stupidity, but I acted out of a calculated lie. My sin is greater. End it with me." She bowed her head, offering her life in a final, desperate act of atonement. She heard his footsteps approach, and she closed her eyes, waiting for the bullet or the blade that would bring a final, clean end to the tragedy she had set in motion. Kaya stood over Elara, the woman who had been his heart and his ruin. The knife at his belt felt heavy as a mountain. Her offer was clean, simple. A life for a life. A death to balance the scales. It was the way of an older time, a time before the complicated lies of the white world had entangled him. He looked at her, kneeling in the dirt, her body braced for the killing strike. He saw the genuine repentance, the absolute surrender. The cold stone in his heart did not melt, but it shifted. To kill her now would not restore his honor. It would not bring back the children he had dreamed of. It would only be the final, bloody act in their shared tragedy, making him the monster the town believed him to be. "The easy path is death," he said, his voice low. The hard path is to live with the truth. He did not draw his knife. Instead, he turned and walked to the edge of the spring, looking into its dark, reflective waters. "You asked me to end it," he said, not looking at her. "I will end it, but not with your death. The whirlwind ends when I say it ends. The town is already broken. Their spirit is cracked. To kill them now would be a mercy. To let them live in the fear they have created, that is the true punishment." He turned back to her, and for the first time, Elara saw not just the anger and the coldness, but a profound, unutterable sorrow. "But you I cannot punish any further. You have condemned yourself to a prison I cannot make more terrible. What will you do?" She whispered. "I am leaving this place," he said. "The White Mountain Apache are my people, but I cannot go back to them as I am. A man who has lost his family and his home is a man of sorrow. I will go north, to the lands of the Navajo, perhaps. I will be a man with no name, no past." He walked toward his horse, which was tethered in the shadows. "The town is safe from me. You can tell them that. Tell them the demon is gone, banished by the truth of the barren woman." The finality in his voice was worse than any anger. It was an ending. "Take me with you," Elara begged, scrambling to her feet. "Please, Kaya, let me share your exile. Let me atone every day for the rest of my life." He stopped, his hand on his horse's flank. He looked at her, and in that moment she saw the ghost of the love that had been a final, fleeting glimpse. "No, Elara," he said softly. "The path I walk, I must walk alone. Our paths joined for a time, and they were beautiful, but they were built on a false foundation. They have now diverged, forever." He swung onto his horse with that same innate grace she had always loved. He did not look back. He rode out of the clearing and was swallowed by the darkness. Elara stood alone by the spring, the truth of vast, empty landscape inside her. He was gone. Not in a blaze of gunfire or a dramatic act of vengeance, but in a quiet, resolute departure that was more devastating than any death. She returned to Solitude as the sun was rising. She walked into the main street, where a few haggard men were cautiously emerging. They looked at her as if she were a ghost. "It's over," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He's gone. He won't be back." She did not wait for their questions or their accusations. She walked to the boarding house, gathered the few possessions that mattered, saddled her horse, and rode out of Solitude the same way she had entered it, alone. She went east. Not back to her old life, which was impossible, but toward an unknown future. She carried the weight of what she had done, a burden she would bear for the rest of her days. In Solitude, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The mines reopened, new horses were bought, a new livery was built. But the town was forever changed. The fear had seeped into the adobe and timber, a lingering chill. They told the story of the Apache ghost and the barren woman for years, a cautionary tale of secrets and vengeance. Silas Rook eventually left, his brand of hatred no longer having a purchase in the broken town, and in the deep canyons of the Arizona Territory, the wind sometimes whistled through a particular stand of pinyon pines, scattering the cold ashes of a burned-out cabin, a quiet monument to a love that was and a truth that came too late. The whirlwind had passed, leaving nothing but silence and ashes on the wind.